Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us on the Type 2 self-assessment forms for 23-24. We are holding a live Q&A session after the last two webinars that we've held, and just to let you know, we do have a dedicated YouTube playlist which has all the videos that will be able to support you in completing your Type 2 self-assessment forms for 2023-24. And we are regularly updating the FAQs on the PCSE website based on the questions that have been asked during the past two webinars, and we'll also be looking at updating them after this evening's session. Okay, so just to let you know who we've got on the call just before we do make a start and jump straight into the questions. So from PCSE, we have Katrina, who's the PCSE Senior Stakeholder Relationship Manager. And then you've got myself and Kat from the PCSE Communications team. From the BMA, we've got Christian Ogwal, who's the Deputy Chair of the Pensions Committee. And from NHS England, we've got Janet Knox, who's the Performance and Assurance Senior Manager. Okay, so we're going to jump straight in then with questions. So I'm going to hand you over to Katrina and Christian.
Thanks, Debbie. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining, as I know that probably quite a lot of you will have sat through at least one of the webinars that we've hosted since the start of this year. So as Debbie's mentioned, we've been conscious on those webinars. We've had lots of questions. We've compiled frequently asked questions and Q&A resources and, updated videos, etc., etc. But this, we thought, if people have got leftover questions that they haven't been able to find the answers to, then we are going to try our best to help. And I'm really grateful to Christian, our colleague from the BMA, supporting us. So we'll kind of play it between us and try and answer your questions. We've got the first question, which is, I have only started salaried jobs in May 2024. Can I clarify there's no need for me to submit assessment form for pensions this year? So processing year and the forms that I've got the deadline of 28th of February is for the pension year of 23-24, which ended on the 31st of March 24. So if you didn't start your salaried posts until May 24, then you're absolutely correct that you don't have to complete the form until next year's round of forms, which would be the 24-25. We have a GP who also works for university. Do I need to declare the university pensions in the Type 2 form, or is it for GP-based work only?
So any pension that you're putting on your Type 2 form has to be what's called practitioner pay. So anything that you work for in a trust would most likely be officer and therefore will not go on the Type 2 form. If you're unsure, if you contact your payroll department or whoever, or finance department or whoever's paying you, just ask the question whether you're an officer or a practitioner, and it's only all your practitioner pay that goes on your Type 2 form.
Yep, university posts, as Christian said, would be officer, so you wouldn't include that on your Type 2. Question from Elizabeth. I rejoined the pension scheme in July 23, so prior to that I opted out and was on maternity leave. Is my tier rate based on my annual salary or my total salary since rejoining? So Elizabeth, if you have rejoined the pension scheme in July 23, so you're obviously in that pension year for this form, because you haven't been a practitioner pension scheme member for the full pension year, you need to fill out the NHS Pensions Annualisation calculator. So you would start, I don't know if you started on the 1st of July or whatever date you started on, go to the annualisation calculator. I think we touch on that on one of the segments that we've recorded in the previous webinars, but there is detailed guidance as well on the NHS Pensions website on how to complete it. So you would enter the start date as whatever date in July. If you've carried on for the rest of the year, your end date for the purposes of that pension year would be the 31st of March 24, and you would enter the salary that the pensionable pay that you had for that period that you've worked from the July to the March, and then press calculate, I think is the button, and when you've done that, then the calculator will throw back to you what the equivalent annual income would be, and therefore which tier rate band you'll be in. or need to be in. I hope that answers that for you. So this is a salaried GP who is also a trainee doctor in a trust. Do I need to include the salary and pension contributions from this job? So we're saying no to that. We're saying yes, if you're a salaried, the salaried role does need to go on, your salaried GP role, sorry, does need to go on the type 2 form, but your trust employment, I would expect that to be officer, so that would not be included in the type 2 form. That's pensioned directly by your employer and doesn't get included in your type 2 form.
There's a question about how to fill in missing years. Do you mean previous pension years that you haven't completed? If that's the question, then you can actually go back and find the relevant type 2 form, complete it and submit it to PCSE. We recommend doing the oldest year first and working through them consecutively, because your pensions record is updated in a consecutive order. So for example, if your 2015-16 year was missing, but all the other years are in place, so you've done the form and you've submitted them, they won't show until that 15-16 slots in. Once that 15-16 slots in, then the other years should follow through. So you can get the previous type 2 forms on the NHS Pensions website and complete them that way.
Yep, thanks, Krishan. And you can, as we've discussed in the previous webinars, the 23-24 type 2 form isn't available on PCSE online for submission. So for this submission window, it is a case of downloading it from the NHS Pensions website and submitting to PCSE through the Contact Us form as shown on the videos. And as Krishan has mentioned, you can do that for your historic missing years as well, but you can also submit those on PCSE online. So you can log into PCSE online and you can select the relevant pension year from the type 2 screen and then complete your form, which submits the data directly. So you do have that option there as well. I started a salaried job in September 23. How can I get the total pensionable earnings? The one on the March payslip is the total for the year, including GP trainee job. Do I need to calculate the payslips from September to April 24? So yeah, I think you've worked out the answer. I think if you've got a combined, the two different roles in the same practice, which is I think the scenario that you're saying in the first part of the year has been from when you were a trainee, which is pension direct and doesn't get included in the type 2 form, then it's the months that you've been a salaried GP that you need to include on your type 2 form. Salary and pension is totally different on PCSE comparing to payslips, which is also different from the other one on the P60. So this is the scenario that we've covered quite a lot and is explained, I think, in the existing Q&A. So just to recap for anyone who hasn't looked at that information already, then the information that is on your employee contribution statement when you log into PCSE online, that's based on the annual estimate that the practice submits at the start of a pension year to list out all of the doctors and what their estimated income and tier rate is going to be, and those deductions are made from the practice by PCSE each month in the pension year. But it might be the case that, for whatever reason, when your pensionable pay and your deductions go through payroll, they may be at a slightly different rate, and so it is quite common that they are different. So the contributions already paid figure that you're going to enter in your type 2 form is what you see in your, usually a month 12 payslip, but in this scenario the figure that you've worked out, and PCSE's process will calculate, once they know what your pensionable pay, true pensionable pay was, actual pensionable pay was, then PCSE's process will calculate whether the practice needs to pay any additional contributions or needs to be refunded because they've paid too much for you. But if you like, as a type 2 GP, you don't really need to be concerned about that. You can look at the form from your own perspective so that you can see, the contributions that you are due to pay, and then you'll know what you've paid through payroll and what needs to be sorted out at that end. So hope that clears that up a little bit.
So it's coming up quite a few times in the chat. In the NHS pension scheme, there is what's called the officer element and the practitioner element. Practitioner element is income that you earn predominantly as a GP, and can be through a GP practice, it can be via an out-of-hours provider, it can be other routes. But some of those, for example, if you're working for a trust, it will be as an officer. Now, anything that's officer does not go on the Type 2 form. Anything that's practitioner does. And the reason is that what they want you to do is add up all your practitioner roles together, work out your total income, and then make sure you're paying the right tier across all of those roles. So, for example, if you earn £10,000 from one role, £40,000 from another role, and £12,000 from another role, they would want you to do that across the whole, what have I said, 40, 10, so £62,000, rather than you pay the tier for 10,000, pay the tier for 40, pay the tier for 12. So that's the rationale of why they want you to add all those roles up. If you're unsure if your role is an officer or a practitioner, your best bet is asking your payroll or finance department. But as a general rule, anything you do in a GP practice is going to be practitioner. Out of hours predominantly are practitioner, but there are a few that can be officer. Anything that's in a trust is 99% going to be officer, if not 100%. So it very much depends on who's employing you and what work you're doing. So that would be my advice, to just ensuring that you're getting the right ones together to make sure you're doing it correctly on your Type 2 form. Otherwise, you may get in the wrong tier and you may be paying the wrong contributions.
Again, on a similar vein, I think there's questions about people who've perhaps been in the same role as a salaried GP, but they've had pay increases throughout the year, maybe 2 or 3, and just some confusion as to what the pensionable pay is to enter on the form. And in simple terms, it's the total that you earned for the year. So regardless of whether you've got 3 months at one amount and another 3 months at a different amount and another 3 months at a different amount, etc., it's the total of all of that. So it would be, that's why for most people, then the easiest place to get that figure is your month 12 payslip. But appreciate if you've not stayed in the same role all year, that's not as simple. But it's the total that you've earned for that role. And then just similar to what Krishan was saying about if you've got different roles in different places, it's that total figure that the tier rate is calculated from. And if you've been a practitioner member for the whole year, then you don't need to worry about the annualisation calculator. You simply look up the tier rate table and see which band that your total pensionable pay falls under, and then that's the percentage that calculates the contributions that you are truly due to pay for that year. And then obviously the purposes of the Type 2 form is to work out whether in the end you have already paid the right contributions or whether or not there needs to be any adjustment.
Can I just follow up on that, if I may? So just to give you an example, if you were working for a GP practice from the 1st of April to the 31st of March next year, and just for argument's sake, say you were doing 2 sessions a week, it doesn't matter because you were in effect employed from that 1st of April to the 31st of March, and therefore annualisation will not affect you. Whereas if you were to be doing a role, say for 3 months, and then you stopped, and then you had a month of locuming, and then you did another salaried role, then you will need to put that into the annualisation calculator, which you can get off the NHS Pensions website, and work out what your tier may need to be adjusted to. If you had one salaried role, a gap, and then another salaried role, you may be annualised, whereas if the salaried roles were back to back, you may not be annualised. But that annualisation calculator, which is available, on, as I say, on the NHS Pensions website, you can put all your start dates and end dates for each role, and it will help work out what your tier should be. Then you take that tier and you go back to the Type 2 form, put that tier in, and then you add in all your roles, and it should work that out for you. There's a few questions about underpayments and overpayments in employee contributions. So, for example, if you're a salary GP working in practice X and it's showing that you've made underpayment, it may be that you picked up another role and therefore your tier changed. As Katrina mentioned earlier, it may be that you've had an increment in your pay for multiple reasons. The best thing to do is go back to your practice manager, explain that your pensionable contribution should be higher, and then they can deduct that from your next month's pay to allocate that. So that's if you've made an underpayment.
one here from someone who's got multiple different roles, again, so similar sort of scenario, but I think a specific question about the solo work. So these roles are GP solo work, so probably just need to understand who that role is for, because then there's out of hours work paid by a trust via payroll. So if the out of hours work paid by the trust is if the pension contributions are being paid direct to NHS pensions, then as Krishan's explained and your accountant has pointed out, that doesn't go on the Type 2 form. Locum work that hasn't been pensioned, then that's obviously not going to go on the Type 2 form. Hospital officer work wouldn't go on the Type 2 form. The GP solo work, then in the majority of cases, as Krishan said, that is normally practitioner work, but you need to clarify with your employer just to make sure, but that looks like that would be the only one of those roles. I think the accountant is saying that if that's the only practitioner income, that would not fulfill the criteria to need a Type 2 form. I'm afraid your accountant isn't correct there. If it is deemed as practitioner work by NHS pensions, then you do, for that role, need to complete a Type 2 form. It's not the case that you need to have a salaried role in a practice to be required to complete a Type 2 form. There are a number of GPs who their roles are all classed as solo, but they do still need to complete a Type 2 form.
There's a question here. It's not quite Type 2 related. It talks about if you're in the 1995 scheme that you can retire prior to 60, your pension is reduced. All I would say is that is correct, but actually it may be more beneficial for you to retire earlier than 60 and take your 95 scheme. My advice is that as you get to 55, 56, you should be getting financial advice whether to take your pension early, because sometimes it is more beneficial. And that's beyond the scope of this webinar, but I just thought I'd answer that because I've seen it, one or two questions on that.
So there's a question here from someone who's worked in a surgery until October 23, and then when they've completed the Type 2 form, they've worked out that they've overpaid contributions. How can I claim this back? And the surgery in question has asked for confirmation that my calculations are correct. How and when would I receive this? So the surgery, you can share a copy of your Type 2 form with the surgery, which would show them the calculations as determined by NHS pensions. They can obviously have a look at the tier rate table and validate that if they don't want to take your word for it. In terms of the practices adjustment, if they've actually overpaid contributions for you, then they will get a refund for that back to them whenever PCSE have completed the reconciliation and processing of your form, which the forms that have been that are all submitted by the 28th of February deadline all need to be processed by PCSE by the middle of June cut-off that NHS Pension sets. Now I appreciate that might seem like an awful long time when you've sent your form in, but just for context, we probably get between 35 and 40,000 forms coming in over the space of usually about 3 or 4 weeks, and they all are then processed by the middle of June. So when PCSE have completed the processing of your form, then they will notify you, but you can, and we'd probably encourage you to share a copy of your form with the practice, because as we mentioned earlier on, what might have been deducted through payroll could be different to what the practice had on the practice estimate. So your reconciliation amounts with them and what you've perhaps had over deducted may be different to what they're going to get back from PCSE in any case, or from NHS England, should I say, through PCSE's processing.
So there's another one about pensionable pay. It is your gross pay. It is not after tax deducted. So your gross pay is your pensionable pay, and that's what you should use on your Type 2 form.
Got one here about, does ICB and appraiser pay need to go on the form? So your appraiser, if your appraiser work is being treated as solo, then it absolutely needs to go on the form. And then your ICB work, if you've got a contract for service, then that will also be treated as solo. So you'll have 2 different solo rows on your Type 2 form. And if the ICB work is contract of service, then that's officer. So if you're not sure, speak to the ICB to double check. The majority of GPs tend to be contract for service, so it's solo work, but you should, please check with them first, because and also if you log into PCSE online and you go to the employee contribution statement button and then you select 23-24, if the solo work is showing there for your two different employees, so you'll have solo appraisal lines for the months, and you'll have a separate solo line if the ICB contributions have come across as solo. So that should be a clear indicator for you. If the ICB contributions are not there, then speak to the ICB just to confirm if that's been treated as an officer post. Just do that. I would suggest you do that before you submit your type 2 form. You don't want to have to sort of go back and forth with people asking you questions about this and that once you've submitted it. So the best thing to do is to do your homework up front, really.
There's a question about I've overpaid my pension from a previous practice. The easiest thing to do is complete your type 2 form. You'll be able to see how much you've overpaid by. Go back to the previous practice and ask them to pay those contributions back to you. That'd probably be the easiest mechanism by which to do that. There's also a question about a salary GP that started in March but wasn't paid until the new tax year. You would still need to complete, Katrina, correct me if I'm wrong, but I still believe you need to complete the type 2 form for 23-24.
Yeah, if you've had pensionable pay, I guess it would, if it's pensionable pay that's fallen under the P60 for that year, then you would need to include that on 23-24. And as far as I know, tax rules are that if you've worked in that month, you need to be taxed in that month. So, but if anybody's done anything creative with your pay slips, then again, speak to your payroll provider before you complete your type 2. There's a question about, are we not an officer in the trainee scheme? Please, can you confirm? Still not understanding that. So if you are still a trainee GP or were a trainee GP in 23-24, then you absolutely don't complete a type 2 form for that role. So again, just to confirm, when you're a trainee GP, then the pension contributions are paid over direct to NHS pensions, and you do not have any requirement to complete any form. It's only once you've qualified as a GP and you start as a salaried GP or a partner, or your role might be out of hours doing solo work, etc., then that's when the type 2 forms start to become relevant.
Another question, if I'm doing GP locum work but not contributing to the pension for that work, do I need to mention it on the type 2 form? No, you don't, because you're not paying any pension on it. But can I just, with my BMA hat on it, can I just give some advice? If you are doing pensionable work, I would really strongly recommend that you do pension it. And if you're choosing not to, I'd get some really good financial advice, particularly in your earlier years. It's much, much more beneficial to pension it because the growth of that pension is far greater than in your latter years. Often people think that they're saving the 12%, but after tax it's about 7-8%. But the growth of that over a career, it can be massive. So just get some financial advice. But in answer to the question, if you're not pensioning locum work, you do not include it on the type 2 form.
Going back to the scenario of underpaying pension. So I've underpaid pension for my calculations. How do I pay the difference? So if we're talking about your practice role, so if you're a salaried GP and what you've worked out is that you should have had a higher tier rate and then you've actually underpaid through the practice, then if you present your type 2 form to the practice, then they will arrange with you how to collect that. If you are a type 2 GP and the underpayment is in relation to some locum work that you've pensioned, then there's a process for locum shortfalls, and that's covered in the guidance explaining how to make the payments and the information that PCSE require alongside your type 2 form to make sure that gets allocated correctly. And if the underpayment is in relation to solo work, then that depends on the type of solo work that it is. But if it is out of hours solo work, then the out of hours provider will liaise with you regarding the underpayment, and the same really when it comes to ICB solo work. If you have been a GP appraiser, then when you submit your type 2 form to PCSE, if there has been an underpayment in relation to that GP appraiser solo work, then PCSE will explain to you how that shortfall needs to be made. So it is a little bit different depending on the scenario that you find yourself in. But if it is purely a practice role or a solo role for hours, etc., the provider or the practice you work for will liaise with you about the collection of the underpayment. And what PCSE do is they take the difference from the practice based on what the practice has already paid. But as I've said a few times now, because that was only based on an estimate the practice submitted, that could end up being different again to what you have. So that's why we say if you've completed your type 2 form, present a copy to the practice, and that shows them where you stand. Someone who has highlighted that they have realised quite recently that they haven't used the correct figures for their pensionable pay, I think, and only recently realised the mistake, and how many years back can I try and rectify this error with PCSE? So I don't know how many years that you have sort of had this scenario for. In theory, there isn't any limit to the corrections that we go back to. You would have to submit a revised type 2 form for each of the years and make it clear when you submit it that you are submitting a revised form because you've different figures have come to light, and you know that the years need to be corrected one by one. I think Krishan's already mentioned that when pension scheme member records are updated, they can only be updated in sequential order on the pension system. So if you have multiple years to get corrected, then all I would ask is that you send them all in together so that the team can start from go back as far as they need to go back and then update them in sequential order for you.
There's a GP here who's been at the same practice for 10 years, 11 years as a salaried GP, and they've not, to their knowledge, had any type 2 forms submitted. So the type 2 form requirement started in the year 2009/10. So if you've got that number of forms to complete, there is a single form that covers 2009/10 until 14/15, and then after that it's individual forms. So as just Katrina just touched upon, it would be helpful to do them all, submit them so that they can update your record. Start with the oldest years first. Do them sequentially if it's too much to do them all in one go. So start with the oldest years first, submit them, and then your record can start being updated. It would be, if you're at the same practice, hopefully it should be quite simple to ask your practice manager for your pensionable pay for each year. And then if you've got any additional roles, you could add those in and do the forms. And then the last bit, you said that you'd like to retire in the next decade. Again, BMA pensions hat on. If you're 52, I would start getting advice around 54, 55 about at what point to retire. Sometimes it's just more beneficial to retire earlier and then come back to work. So just retiring from the pension scheme. But again, slightly outside the scope of type 2 forms.
There's a question here from Seema. So what you're saying is that on the employee contribution statement, PCSE has my monthly salary is much lower than it actually was. So it's quite a detailed question. So just pausing on that part of it. Hopefully you've picked up from some of the other comments and feedback that we've given that the monthly salary on the PCSE employee contribution statement is based on the estimated figures that the practice provided at the beginning of the year. So that's what's been deducted from the practice so far. That what's on your employee contribution statement is what's been deducted from the practice for you so far. So that's the first bit. So you then say they've also my employer and employee contribution lower than it should be, and if your salary was estimated at lower than it should be, then yes, your employee and employer contributions will be showing as lower than they should be. And as I say, that's what's been deducted from the practice so far. So when I'm completing my type 2 self-assessment, it tells me I have underpaid the employee contribution So remember, when you're completing your Type 2 self-assessment, the figures that you put in for contributions already paid are the figures from your payslip, not from PCSE Online. The figure from PCSE Online goes in the very end column on the Type 2, but the column, so you have your pensionable income, then it asks you for employee contributions already paid by the GP. That comes from your payslip, and that calculation then is the difference that you have between what your employer has deducted from you and what you needed to pay. So what should I do? So you should complete the Type 2 form, follow those instructions to record the figures from your payslip, month 12 payslip on the Type 2 form. Your difference column will then be showing you whether you've actually underpaid or overpaid through payroll. Show that to the practice, and they will work with you to, on what the local process is for correcting that, so whether you owe any contributions or they owe you. And then PCSE will do the reconciliation bit with the practice to make sure that they take the additional contributions that are due from the practice. So they've underestimated. We look at the figures that are the true figures based on your actual pensionable pay for the year, and PCSE's role is to take that difference from the practice, and it's the figures based on your pensionable pay that get inputted to your pension record on Pensions Online, not what's currently on your employee contribution statement. So please don't worry about that. So I think the question was, what should I do? What are the next steps that I should take here to ensure the correct amount of employer contribution goes towards my pension? So hopefully that answers that. If you complete that Type 2 form and submit it to PCSE, PCSE will take from your practice, once they've processed it, the system will automatically deduct from your practice the following month the difference in contributions that are due, and it's that overall contribution figure that will go into your pension record, so that you've got the correct amounts that are then showing when you get your NHS pension statement. So that was quite a detailed question. Hopefully the way I've broken down the answer has helped, and maybe helped one or two other people as well.
So there's a question here about McLeod and the 1995 scheme. So at the time, you should have completed the form in whichever scheme you were in, whether it be the 1995 or the 2015. Because of McLeod, many people may not know this, for 7 years between 1995 and 2022, you'll be put back into your what's called legacy scheme. That's either 1995 or 2008. That will be corrected effectively at retirement. So you complete the form at the moment, depending on which scheme you're in, and that's the correct way to do it. I know that's confusing, and I'm sorry if I've confused lots of people, but McLeod will essentially be corrected at a later point.
There's a couple of questions that are quite different I want to pick up here. Previous online forms don't have two columns for actually paid from the payslip and the practice estimated amount, so which should be entered here. So thank you for asking that question. As we've said, if you've got older years still to submit, then you can use the PCSE online solution, and it's quick to do. So PCSE's key figure that you're entering really is the pensionable pay. So your the figure that you enter in the column for actually contributions already paid, the PCSE screen will auto-populate in a lot of cases with what's already in the system, but you can override that to the figure that's on your payslip so that you can see the difference that you need to discuss with your practice. But PCSE, from that Type 2 that you submit, will be interested in, and the key figure is the pensionable pay, because all of the other information we already have. And then sort of linked to that, but more for the paper form, someone's asked, and I've forgotten who it was now, about that end column on the Type 2 form for the 23-24 version, and do we need to take that from the employee contribution statement on PCSE Online? So that's absolutely where you will get that figure from, just based on the explanation that I've just given previously, when we've broken down that kind of detailed scenario for the other GP, I think it was SEMA. But it's just to point out, it's not mandatory to complete that column. So I think we've pointed that out in all of the guidance, but it is, I think, helpful for you to be able to check those figures, because you will then see, you know, what the situation is for the practice, but PCSE will sort that out with the practice. Your interest really is in discussing with the practice whether you've got any difference to make in terms of if you've overpaid or underpaid contributions.
So there's a question from Fenella, how do I find out what years are missing? So there's two main ways to do that. So you can go into the PCSE portal and have a look if any of your type 2 forms have not been submitted. The other route to do is you can write to NHS Pensions, ask for a statement, and then basically your statement will be up to a specific year. Anything after that may be missing because 1 year's missing, or maybe multiple years missing. On the BMA Pensions website, I have written a step-by-step guide with some template letters to help you along the way. There is also a little YouTube video that we've done there to show. So if you go to the BMA website, type in my name in the search bar, you should be able to find it. It's the GP Pension campaign. But in essence, any years that you do find missing, as I've mentioned earlier, you need to go back and do the relevant forms, contact PCSE, submit them, and then, as I say, do them consecutively so your record can be updated. And just to give you some timelines, so I don't know if we touched on this today, we're at the moment looking at the 23-24 pension year end. So that pension year end ended on the 31st of March 2024. The forms are due to be submitted 11 months later, so the 28th of February 2025. PCSE then have a period of time to process them and essentially hand them over to NHS Pensions, and then NHS Pensions will update your pension record. And that normally happens around the second or third week of August. So 31st of March 2024, all being well, and all your previous years being submitted will be updated in August 2025. So nearly about 15, 18 months later. So that's just the kind of timelines that the pension records routinely in GP land take to update.
I think there's another clarification from Faisal on the combination of roles that he has and the fact that his accountant says he doesn't have to submit the Type 2. And Faisal, you've helpfully pasted the guidance from the NHS Pensions website about who needs to complete a Type 2 form. I think, as Krishan and I both said, if you have an out of hours post or a GP solo post that you're not sure as to whether it needs to go through it's come through practitioner or officer route, then please do check with the provider, because they will know the circumstances of their organisation and the arrangements that NHS Pensions have sort of dictated or determined that their organisation needs to use. There are some nuances to this, so we can't give a hard and fast sort of rule, I'm afraid, but do speak to your provider just to clarify. There are some questions. A couple of people have mentioned about previously rejected forms and what to do. I think there was a question, a follow-up from you, Francoise, about if you've used the figure from your payslip, I think you were saying, in the online Type 2 form before, and it was rejected. So that shouldn't have been rejected. And there was clarification to the PCSE team in the spring of last year, really, that the figures could be accepted regardless of whether the GP had recorded salaried figures or the PCSE online figures there. So if you have a rejected form, if you check the figures and click resubmit in that, then that should get you around that.
Can I just go back to the question of Faisal? So what I understand he's asking is that he essentially has a single pensionable solo role, which is his out of hours work. Even if you have a single role, PCSE won't know if you have other roles or not. Therefore, even if you have a single role, you still need to do a Type 2 form, because PCSE will never know that the locum work that you did is pensionable or what have you, and that you pay the correct year, because they won't be able to put that together. So even if you've got a single role that is pensionable, you still need to do a Type 2 form, is my point.
So there's a question about a maternity scenario. The scenario is started 23-24 year on maternity leave, so then came back in May 24, was at that salaried role for 6 months and then changed to a different salaried role for 6 months. On On the authorised leave tab is the deemed pay, what I should have got for the 6 months of each salaried role, and as if I put the full year salary for each salaried role, deemed pay is double. Yeah. So I think you need to just work through that one carefully, because you've got two different roles. So first of all, your type 2 form has sort of row 2, row 2.1, row 2.2 for people who have different salaried roles. So you're going to have each post on a different role. And I think, so you returned in May 24, and that's salaried. Yeah, so your approved leave is going to be for your first post, isn't it? So it's going to be relevant to the first role that you were in. So it just needs a little bit of careful handling, that one, I'm afraid. But yeah, what I would also encourage you to do is, when you're submitting your type 2 form through the Contact Us page, there is a box before you submit it for comments and extra information. I would just clearly state all of that, because as you'll see yourself, it's not that easy to determine from the type 2 form, because the type 2 form doesn't actually require you to record whether you started or finished a post mid pension year. The type 1 form does, but the type 2 form doesn't. So it's just worthwhile putting all of that information when you submit your form, and that means that the PCSE team will have, you know, everything at hand there to explain your scenario, and then they can come back to you if they need anything further.
So there's a question from Rebecca in relation to having issues with the annualisation calculator. When you download it, there's you can right click and disable macros. And if you do that, it should work. On some PCs, for some reason, it enables the macros and therefore doesn't work. It's not quite as simple as doubling the pensionable pay if you've worked 6 months, but it will probably give you a similar answer. But just try downloading it again and just disable the macros, and the calculator should work. If it doesn't, just try it on a different PC. There's also a question from someone who's due to retire in May 2025. A bit of advice from a pension point of view: you may find it easier to retire on the 31st of March 2025. I'm not sure if it's too late to do that, but of course you can retire whenever you wish. Again, it might be get some financial advice as to the benefits of retiring 2 months later. When you come to do your last year, there's a different form that you will submit, an AW8, and that will help them collate the last years to make sure that the pension contributions are correct. When calculating your pension, we wouldn't make you wait. They wouldn't make you wait 18 months for the process to happen to get that corrected. There was another question about ODS numbers. ODS number is the E number that practices have, and you can often ask your practice manager for that.
Just to jump in there, Krishan, it depends on which part of the country you are. So in one part of the country it starts with E, but you know, if you're up here in the northeast, it starts with A. So it's it does have a different starting letter, just in case people are panicking. It's not all E. Okay, but just on that, actually, I think we gave this tip out last time, didn't we? But just to recap on it, the easiest way, you can ask the practice manager, obviously, for the ODS codes. It's the unique identifier for the practice. But if you log into your PCSE online employee contribution statement, you select the year 23-24, then there's a filter for income type. I think you don't need to worry about that really, but there's another filter for practices, and there'll be a drop down, and you'll see, you know, the practice. If you've worked at multiple practices, they'll all be listed, and the ODS code will be next to the practice name. So that's the quickest and easiest way to grab that. There's a scenario here from Elizabeth, who opted out in the pension scheme in June 2019 when returned from overseas. However, employee contribution statement suggests that there was contributions paid in 19 to 22. I didn't complete a type 2 form because I wasn't contributing. So Elizabeth, this goes back to the fact that the employee contribution statement is populating with what's been deducted from the practice based on the estimates they've submitted. So if they've not, so it means that those contributions have been deducted from the practice, and at some point the practice needs to get that back from PCSE, or through PCSE's processes back from NHS England. So you've opted out. It looks like your opt-out so you're still at that practice, aren't you? But you've opted out. So if you just, I suggest that the practice manager actually submits a pensions contributions query to PCSE through the Contact Us form, and to clarify that you've opted out at that point. I presume you've submitted the opt-out through the correct channels, etc. And assuming that you did, then the contributions query team just need to resolve that for the practice. And when they have resolved that for the practice, then you will see your employee contribution statement kind of being reversed to show 0 for those years. But you're right, if you didn't have pension deducted and you had already opted out, you don't need to complete a Type 2 form. But currently, obviously, the records look like you do.
So there's a question from Dinaz about I think it's the same question regarding the 2C column, contributions paid and not paid by the practices. 2C column is not mandatory. So if you don't know the answer to those, you can leave them blank and PCSE will resolve those. There's a question here from Mohammed. If we work in 2 practices, do we submit the Type 2 form twice? No, both practices go on the same form, because the whole logic, as I mentioned earlier, is you need to put all your practitioner pay together to work out which tier you should be in. So if you went, say, 40 from one and 40 from another, if you did them separately, you'd have 2 different tiers. Whereas if you add it together, you get 80,000, you'd be in the 12.5% tier. So all your practitioner roles go on one Type 2 form, unless you're working in England and Wales, where you have to send one to Wales and one to England.
Indeed. And just on that, when the 2 rows go onto the one form, Mohammed, then you'll see that there's row 2, and then there's row 2.1, and there's row 2.2. So you record the pensionable pay for each of the rows separately. So on the personal details page, you'll have 2 rows in the table, one for practice 1 and the ODS code there, and then the second for practice 2 and the ODS code there. And then when you go to the pay details tab, then you enter your pensionable pay for the first row, and in row 2, and then row 2.1 you would enter the pensionable pay and the contributions for the second row, and then second row. And as Krishan says, the purpose then of the Type 2 form, as you go down to the total row, then that will add everything up together, and that's where you get your overall calculation.
So there's a question about what happens if your Type 2 form is not completed. Does our pension contribution not get to our pension pot? So a few bits there. So firstly, essentially, your pension isn't lost. It just basically hasn't been allocated. So your Type 2 forms need to be completed, because NHS Pensions ultimately won't know that you've paid the correct tier across all your roles. So for your record to be updated, you will need to complete these forms at some point. And obviously trying to do them within year is actually mandatory, and it would be helpful for you and NHS Pensions as well. In terms of the second part, does a contribution not get to a pension pot? There is no such thing. Your contribution doesn't pay towards your pension. Your pension is based on your pensionable pay, and there is no pot, because it's essentially based on an imaginary value, which is your pensionable pay, and that increases over time. But in essence, the point I want to get across is it's really important that you do these Type 2 forms to make sure that you're paying the right tier across all your practitioner pay, to make sure that it's submitted and goes across to your pension record.